Hello, friends. Lately, I've been seeing a whole lot of stuff about this phenomenon that just happened, something that a lot of us thought we would never see and thought it would be, out of the question because of the people involved and the personalities of the people involved and the things they've said about each other over the years. I'm talking about the Talking Heads. They were a pretty important band in, those punk rock days, the late 70s, early 80s. They were in that CBGB scene that I've talked about, bands like the Ramones and the Dead Boys and all these other punk rock bands. But in those days, like I've said before, punk rock was a weird word, weird label for something that was happening on the street that involved absolute freedom of expression, and it meant what it meant to me, and to a lot of my friends, because I've talked to them about this. What it meant to me was a freedom of expression, like real freedom. You could go out and you can afford to buy a cheap guitar at the pawn shop and you can start a band. Being in a band wasn't something like being in Pink Floyd anymore, or Queen, or Led Zeppelin, or the Rolling Stones. Those bands were so out of reach. They were superstars, and you go see, Electric Light Orchestra, or Yes, at, concert, Alice Cooper, or whatever, and their production was $10 million zillion budget, and their albums were hugely produced and all this kind of stuff, and it was so out of reach to the average kid on the streets who also had ideas and maybe felt like writing songs to express themselves. Punk rock kind of made it so you could go out there and buy the cheapest equipment, the cheapest gear, borrow something from your friend, get some cheesy speakers at the pawn shop, or the cheapest thing you could get, and nobody was going to judge you for that because it was punk rock. It was street level. That's what the Talking Heads represented as well. They showed up in a time when, there was like a lot of flashy fashion going on in the, Captain and Tennille and whatever else was on FM radio at the time. People were really into looking good and disco and all that. But then Talking Heads show up. They've all got the really short hair, like they just walked out of art school or college or something. And they wore their street clothes, it looked like. I mean, they were just wearing like regular short sleeve shirts. And they just looked like the most normal people you would see on the street. And that at the time, it's hard to imagine now, but that at the time was pretty radical. And the music they did wasn't angry, it wasn't aggressive, and it wasn't angsty. It was angsty, yeah, it was. It wasn't angry. It was about other kinds of uncomfortableness with the world. You'd hear the Ramones, and they were just talking about good times and funny stuff. They were doing kind of humorous rock songs, kind of based on the old, like the girl groups and things like that. Really amazing Ramones stuff out there. I love it. I love the early Ramones. But the Talking Heads, oddly enough, very similar to the Ramones in that way that they were kind of being a little bit humorous with some of their stuff, and they were a little off kilter with the context of some of their songs. The guitars were not distorted, and they were playing this music. They were related to Jonathan Richman. They were band members, Jerry Harrison, and Jonathan Richman was this sort of unpretentious. He sort of didn't care that he wasn't cool. He was cool because he was so uncool, I guess. And he wrote songs about things that were almost too real, too close to home. It was like, it's a little embarrassing to hear him talking about some of the things he talked about in the songs. And that's kind of the way the Talking Heads were. They were singing songs about these things that were, not what you typically hear in a pop song. Their first album is just a brilliant thing that came out of nowhere, Talking Heads 77. This sort of Dayglow, you can't really see it in the video, but this was shockingly bright color when you go into the record store and see this. It was just a blank, shocking pink record cover. And then a picture of the band on the back, you know, they all just look, like I was saying, it's like a plaid shirt and like a button-up shirt. Really normal haircuts and stuff. And this is back when her name was Martina Weymouth, and David Byrne and all the other, you know, Chris Frantz and Jerry Harrison, fantastic musicians in a way that had not been really heard too much, other than, you know, Jonathan Richman and some other kind of experimental musicians who weren't trying to be tough or angry. Talking Heads showed up kind of similar in some ways to the band Television, and yet David Byrne's lyrics and his approach to his stage presence was so awkward, and that kind of made you feel like he wasn't comfortable up there on the stage. And the rest of the band members seemed like they had not been playing in a band for very long, but they were quite good. I mean, they just generated, they projected this kind of awkward uneasiness that a lot of people were feeling. You know, a lot of young people feel that way. They looked at David Byrne and the rest of the band members and they were like, wow, those are like my friends. That would be like if me and my friends started a band. That's what we would be like. We would be uncomfortable and we'd be singing songs about stuff that happened to us and things that we think about, weird things that we think about. You know, like making a movie, and you know, songs like Who Is It, and Psycho Killer, and Don't Worry About the Government, and a song about the book I read. And it's there was also a kind of grooviness to, like a groove in here, like sort of hinting at a kind of a funky groove, which was really head bobbing. You know, it was kind of danceable. It was like you listen to this record and you can't help but just like, this is so cool. This is like really cool. And then they had a second album, which was just as good, I think. And some ways maybe a little bit better, a little bit more. Yeah, there's so many good songs on here. Take Me to the River. You know, you've heard that. Girls Want to Be with the Girls. And songs about being in art school and things like that. The cover is made out of a collection of Polaroids that were taken of the band, you know, like that in sequence and then assembled into this. And there's kind of a thermal map image of the United States on the back, the contiguous states. Tina Weymouth's bass playing is so prominent on these albums, and such an excellent foundation. And her husband, Chris Frantz, the drummer, I think they are such a powerful presence on these early albums. And, you know, of course, Jerry Harrison, and of course David Byrne, and his quirky angular guitar playing, and his almost his angsty, almost like panic attack type of singing, really made this such a strange album. I know it doesn't seem strange now, but at the time when these records came out, they were unique and strange, and yet they had this great, almost like a Motown vibe, a beat. Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth, really great rhythm section. Of course, they went on and did Tom Tom Club, so obviously they know how to be a rhythm section. But they held this band, I think, in a way that doesn't get enough attention. They were so solid and so groovy and grooving and in the pocket and all that stuff. And you know, that when you have that foundation of a great rhythm section, you can lay all kinds of stuff on top of that and make incredible songs around that foundation. If you have a good solid foundation, you can build whatever you want on top of that, and it'll stand up. And this album is fantastic, and I think one of my favorites of theirs is still this one. This one is called Fear of Music. It has this really cool textured album cover. I don't know if it's visible on the video, but it's got that kind of diamond plate metal texture embossed in the cover. And the back is just that. Probably looks better without the plastic. Yeah, there you go. Now you can see it. The cool texture. Very cool. This album has some of my favorite Talking Heads moments on it. And oddly, I'm one of those people, I don't know if this is weird or not, but I remember when Remain in Light came out after this, and the records that they did after this one, I kind of lost a little interest in them. I kind of felt like they weren't this awkward little combo anymore of awkward art students writing songs about the strange pursuits of their lives and their observations about the street level strangeness of being a intellectual kind of art student, awkward pop band. I felt like they moved into this kind of area where they were using a lot of studio musicians who were awesome. And in recent years, I've kind of developed an appreciation for their later stuff. But I remember going to see that movie, Stop Making Sense, which was just re-released recently because the band actually, the copyright, the ownership, in other words, reverted back to the band. So they re-released it, kind of restored it, did the kind of, restoration stuff and released it in theaters, and they did a tour. That's how come they're sort of hanging out together again. I don't know if they're going to do an album or do any shows. That would be really cool, and I think they know how cool that would be if they got together and did some shows. But my wish is that they would do it as a four-piece. Do it like those first three albums when it was just the four of them, and it had that kind of sparse sound. It kind of had a fragile vibe to it. There were some other bands around the time that were doing that kind of fragile pop. There were like the Feelies and bands like that. But the Talking Heads had a kind of an intellectual edge, and the four-piece fragility of the music is what I really loved about those first three albums. And then when the later ones happened, the musicianship was fantastic. And there was so many people involved in their albums now, and I think the movie Stop Making Sense kind of shows that, because it starts off with just David Byrne with a boombox, right? I haven't seen it since it came out, but then they gradually add more members, the other members of the band, and then it's the four-piece band, Talking Heads, but then the other people start coming in, and it's almost like a visual representation of what happened to the band, in my opinion, where they sort of lost their focus. They became phenomenal. I mean, they became a huge phenomenon. That's when people really started to pay attention to them. But it's when me and some of my friends started thinking that they may have gotten a little bit too overwhelmed with this kind of filling up the stage with a bunch of really great musicians. And really people who had a lot of experience and a lot of the musician, the gravitas of this musicianship that was on the stage with them kind of took away that idea of these four angsty, sort of awkward art school students who I think that's what a lot of us sort of loved about them was the fact that they weren't the most accomplished people, but they were actually really good. They were playing these grooves. They were in the pocket. They were doing these unique things with guitars and keyboards, and Jerry Harrison doesn't get enough credit, I think, for what he brought to the band with his musicianship. And then, like I said, Tina and Chris France, they were such a great rhythm section. And then David Byrne on top of that was so great. And on those first albums, I thought were like the pinnacle of the Talking Heads. To me, that's the Talking Heads. After that, they sort of became the Talking Heads plus another huge band. I mean, I like it now when I listen to it. I don't reject it the way I did when I was younger, and I felt like I had lost the Talking Heads, and instead of the Talking Heads, it was like all these great musicians now, and it's like, yeah, they're really good, but where's the Talking Heads? Where's that almost going off the rails vibe that they used to have? That kind of, four people playing on a stage at CBGB's and not knowing if they're gonna lose the thread or not. Can they hang on? Are they really cut out to do this? Are they gonna make it? I kind of missed that about them. And but anyway, I mean, I like them now, and it was really cool to see them back together. I think I saw them on some talk shows, and they were on the Colbert Show and things like that. There's videos of them, lots of pictures of them standing together, four of them lined up, and they all still play. They all look healthy. Jerry Harrison is out there doing shows with Adrian Belew and a bunch of other incredible musicians. I always wondered why there wasn't more action from the Tom Tom Club, but I guess they just living life, living their lives. And David Byrne has, of course, been involved in a zillion things, all kinds of stuff, productions, soundtracks, music, collaborations. Around the time the Talking Heads, he did an album with Brian Eno called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, which is really incredible. Love that album. It's inspired, a lot by some predecessors like Holger Touquet of Can, and some other people who were using found loops of dialogue and things like that over these sort of beats. But Eno and David Byrne did something really cool with My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. It has a real interesting feel to it, real fun approach to the idea of using found sampled dialogue. Some of them are perfectly strange, but there's this driving sort of funky beat going on, and that's where David Byrne, I think, wanted to live, in those funky beats, the funky music of kind of world music, kind of inspired by African rhythms, African beats, some other countries that he visited or listened to the music of and incorporated into his own sound. And it's now I listen to it and I'm like, yeah, it's pretty good. As you get older, you get a little bit more tolerant of things that maybe rubbed you the wrong way when you were younger, and you felt like you were losing your band that you liked. It's like, that's not the band, that's some other band. But Talking Heads, still listen to those first three albums. I have to say, I still really like those. I like what they evoke in my memory. That feeling, like I talk about with that word punk rock, where people were suddenly people who normally wouldn't have been making music were suddenly now able to make music because it was okay to not be excellent, to not be the best or the fastest shredder or the most emotional and crazy stage presence or whatever. You could be a band without being Queen. You didn't have to be Freddie Mercury. You could be somebody like David Byrne, who seemed like the nerdiest guy from art school, picked up a guitar and just started stream of consciousness observing his surroundings with some really talented pals that could play bass and drums and keyboards and guitar. And that's what I liked about Talking Heads. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say about them. I like their first three albums, and who knows if I'm being pretentious by saying I did not like the ones afterwards. I did like them. I just felt like they weren't the same band. I didn't like them as much. And now, as an older person, I look back and I'm like, I like all their stuff. They were a lot more important to some of my friends, some of my other friends and acquaintances than they were to me. After these first three albums. But anyway, that's all I'll say about the Talking Heads for now. And thanks for listening. And I'll talk to you again real soon.